All right, well, thank you for coming to this talk. I'm really excited to be talking about some of this work we've been doing over the past, I guess, a year. That's a length of time I hadn't fully appreciated. And we talking about some work we're trying to, or essentially show and draw connections between different drivers of insect decline, kind of jokingly titled Death by 852 Cuts, which should make sense as the talk goes on. I'm going to try to keep this on the relatively short side, hopefully about 30 minutes to leave plenty of time for, of course, questions, but also discussion about maybe potential avenues of meta-analysis, maybe inspired by this talk. But okay, so I don't have to click. Okay, I don't have to, we're all here because, insects, there are these widespread reports of insect declines, and that's basically all I'm going to say because it doesn't really probably need to be said much to this audience that, of course, not all insects are declining everywhere, but this is a phenomenon that has popped up all across the world with these increasing studies. But it's not just these. We now are seeing increasing studies that are synthesizing these literature, right? Increasing reviews that are summarizing all that we've learned. And from this, of course, we know that there are many drivers of decline. And we also know and probably feel intuitively that drivers of decline are connected. Just taking this figure here from the Death by 1,000 Cuts paper, we can think about pollution, for instance. And pollution, of course, is going to be driven by things like urbanization and agriculture, which then might cause things like nitrification and insecticides. Things might get complicated by an introduced species, which can also be driven by urbanization, globalization, agriculture, which maybe more pollutants like insecticides or herbicides are introduced to combat those, might have effects on beneficial insects. All these things might interact, right? So you might be that a landscape that's been converted to agriculture, a little bit of habitat loss is fine, but then insecticides in those same landscapes is just too much for a population to handle. And then when you really start to think about this, you start to feel a little crazy. Because it might be that, we can have studies and reviews that can consider one of these or even two of these topics together in their interaction, but really much more than that is largely unfeasible, either given data or just, time and sanity. And so the goal of the work I'm going to be presenting today and what we've been working on is to identify proposed drivers of insect declines and their connections. Kind of to give kind of a backdrop of how these things might work or how things seem to be connected, what seems to be more strongly connected. We did this by performing a meta-synthesis where we performed a literature search of reviews and meta-analyses and other papers like that. And from these, we extracted the proposed causal pathways that are mentioned in these papers. And then from here, we built this into a network of linked ideas. And the idea behind this was essentially that if you could get all of the people, we could get 1,000 people that all think about these, their respective taxa, regions, drivers, all into a room to get a giant, a giant yarn and, cork board, what would this look like? And so to do this, we first performed, of course, a literature search. Using terms that the paper had to, of course, include terms that are about insects. We used, I think, the string that for insect terms included like 50 words, if not more, that included papers that just talk about insects, but also all of the orders, very specific terminology as well, be very inclusive of papers. Then they had to also in the same kind of area of the paper mention something about declines or extinctions, about terms that are typically associated with papers on insect declines. And this returns 3,387 papers that have been published since 2017, which we ended up using as we kind of wanted to assess what's been learned since the kind of Hallman et al. And the start of this kind of, quote, insect apocalypse kind of research agenda. So we went to papers since 2017. Of course, it wouldn't be a paper, or we wouldn't be a review or a meta-synthesis without showing some sort of time series like this, which here I'm just showing how publication rates for 5 different kind of subsets of the literature have changed over time. And what we see here is that, these have all been scaled within their group. So for instance, we're looking at how papers about insects, how more have been published in, say, 2023 than since 1980, but all within that group. And we see that, of course, there's a general increasing publication rate. We see, especially starting around this dotted line, which would be 2017, papers about just insects in general, which is this kind of mustard color, and insect declines, which is this burnt orange color, have both increased at a much quicker rate than just other papers, say, about just biodiversity or about declines in general. And from this set of over 3,000 papers, we then reviewed the papers to extract only papers that are meta-analyses, commentaries, perspectives, or reviews. So essentially, there's no primary data being introduced in the paper. It's people discussing other papers of primary data. And it wasn't just that, they also had to, in the paper, talk about causes of decline. So it's not enough for the paper to just have reviewed rates of decline. There has to be some sort of causal link in the paper. This limited to 175 synthesis papers, which we then read. From reading the papers, we extracted the hypothesized drivers of insect decline from the text and then turned it into a network. Now, this data extraction process is kind of fundamental to everything I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to describe what this actually looked like in practice. So this is an excerpt from Dave Wagner's 2020 Insects in the Anthropocene review. And I apologize. I'm going to do the thing you should never do in a talk and actually read all of this. So everyone brace yourselves. But this excerpt, right, many recent reports of insect decline are attributable to changes in agricultural practices. Modern farms involve herbicide-tolerant crops that encourage herbicide use, are planted with genetically modified varieties that produce insect toxins, embrace monoculturing, have become increasingly dependent on pesticides and fertilizers. The collective impacts of modern farming practices are highly detrimental to biodiversity in general, and insects in particular. So this is a lot. There's a lot in here. We can quickly read this and see that there are causes and there are outcomes for insects with mediators. We can focus on terms like this. And if we turn this into a network, it would look something like this, where we say changes in agricultural practices are driving things like GMOs, monoculturing, pesticides, which then have negative outcomes for insect biodiversity. So I'm just going to focus on one of these pathways for now, because we also, there's variation between papers in how terms are used. So we also needed to synonymize terms across papers. And so in this case, this pathway would remain mostly the same, except we would change changes in agricultural practices to agricultural intensification. And we quickly kind of realized there were patterns that we could group terms into to make them comparable across papers. We also wanted to group terms at different levels of resolution. So for instance, at the highest resolution with the most, you could say the most complicated network, it might be so complicated that we can't extract anything from it. So we wanted to have different levels of detail that we could summarize pathways at. So for instance, a lower level of detail here would just say agriculture leads to pollution, which leads to changes in insect biodiversity. And this is going to be a caveat for essentially the whole talk. And it is a pretty important point, that what we're doing is we're creating a network of hypotheses. And not all of these may be tested or based upon data. If it was in a paper that somebody wrote saying, we think this is important, which is, of course, often going to be based on data, especially in review papers, but not always. This is a network of hypotheses, and there's potentially some pathways that remain, well, there are many that remain unquantified, but there might be even some that just lack a lot of data to begin with. And finally, just some terminology. A node is going to refer to either a response or a predictor variable, and then the edge is the link that actually connects them. So, okay. So I present to you the first of many of these sorts of figures you're going to see in this talk. What I'm showing you here is a network of proposed drivers at the lowest resolution, kind of the least detailed look at this. And what we're looking at here is just the interconnections among drivers of insect decline, at least what people say are drivers of insect decline. And how you read this is you want to pay attention to the colors, where they come from and where they're going to. So for instance, for agriculture, in the top right here in this purple color, we see that the purple leaves agriculture and goes into land use change, which would be telling us that a certain swath of hypotheses say that agriculture causes land use change. We also can pay attention to like the number scales and the length of the edge, which tells us the number of times that this driver has been proposed in the set of papers that we looked at. So some conclusions from this is, first, nodes relating to habitat quality were the most abundant. This would be things like floral resources, plant availability. Those are things that got grouped in habitat quality. These were the most abundant, but mostly as a mediator, because we can see that almost everything goes in habitat quality, which then from there would go to some outcome for an insect, but not a lot comes out of it. There are about 3 sets of drivers here that are almost exclusively what we're calling ultimate or really upstream drivers, which are urbanization, agriculture, and climate, where things come out of those, but not much goes into them. And in those cases, agriculture was by far the most frequently mentioned upstream driver of insect declines. And overall, the network is actually very connected. So for each individual node in the network, it averages about being connected to 30% of the other nodes in the network, which I interpreted as being quite highly connected. And that wasn't surprising when I saw it, but there is an alternate version that wasn't true. You could imagine quite a modulated network where, say, 2 or maybe 3 types of drivers are all linked to each other, but they're not linked to the others. But that largely wasn't the case of what we found, at least mentioned in the synthesis literature. So now is the chaos version. This is what the network looks like at the highest resolution, or the most detailed terms that we extracted from the papers. So now I've added the response variables as well, the outcome variables, which are shown in the white in the bottom right. And I don't expect anybody to get much out of this just by looking at it. But one thing you can get out of it is that there are 852 unique edges in this network, which of course is where death by 852 cuts. So over the next few slides, I'm going to kind of go through this network and highlight some either important nodes or important characteristics as we go, to kind of hopefully give some idea of how this thing actually is structured. So probably the first and most obvious thing we can do is just look at which nodes at this higher resolution are the most frequently mentioned. And that's what I'm showing you here with this bar plot, where on the x-axis, we have just the number of times it was mentioned in our set of papers, and on the y-axis, we have the individual nodes, and they're colored by the kind of broader class of driver that they belong to. And the first thing that you notice when looking at this is that a lot of the most highly mentioned terms are not very specific. Insecticides are fairly specific, but beyond that, we have things like just agriculture in general, unspecific climate change, or unspecific pesticides, which this meant that when we read the paper, it would be something like pesticide leads to population decline, which is somewhat descriptive, but of course, pesticides can be broken into many, there are many types of pesticides. There are many aspects to climate change. So these really don't tell us exactly what the actual mechanism is. So if you remove those, to look at the more specific nodes, we see that insecticides in the papers we found are absolutely the most dominant node that is mentioned. They're mentioned almost twice as much as the next closest, which would be habitat loss. And it's here I definitely want to pause and make an important point, which is that this, of course, doesn't mean that insecticides are twice as important to global insect decline as habitat loss. They could be, but this is probably going to be, this is going to also be confounded with, all of the biases that, like publication biases, that might lead to insecticides being mentioned more. And these don't equal effect sizes. That said, I think it's still interesting that this is the pattern we get in the literature. And beyond insecticides, though, to kind of the next maybe best 10, we do see more diversity among different driver types of things that are mentioned. We see things about habitat loss, habitat quality, pathogens, climate change. Yeah. And of course, that's just the most abundant nodes, but it wouldn't be, what's the point in doing a network if I don't at least give you something about a network statistic? So the next thing I'm going to highlight is again looking at nodes, but I'm going to compare how frequently they're mentioned, which will be on the y-axis, which will be what I showed you on the previous slide, compared to how central they are in this network. This is the metric I'm using is betweenness centrality, which is a measure of how connected something is to all of the other nodes in the network, how much information passes through them. And we see that terms related to insecticides and agriculture, while very frequently mentions, just as are very frequently hypothesized, they're by no means actually that well connected in the network. Inversely, we have, and probably as you would expect, but variables relating to habitat quality and land use change are much more connected, and they're much more connected than they are mentioned, if that makes sense. I'm showing this kind of one-to-one line here that something like, say, habitat fragmentation is very well connected, despite actually not having that many been proposed that many times, at least relative to some of the other stressors. Which I think is interesting to consider from a network perspective, in that, if you were to put some action or control, more information passes through those, which means they're more connected to upstream drivers, but they're also more widely connected to more of the outcome variables that people are measuring. So far, I've been thinking about types of stressors, but there's also, of course, the other side of the causal pathway, which is the outcomes for insects. And largely, these could be grouped into 5 different categories or levels. So this is a Sankey plot, where on the left, we see the drivers, and on the right, we see where their relative proportion is distributed to. And in this case, we see that this ranges from community all the way to genetics. And outcomes are most often considered at the population or at the individual level. But pollution is disproportionately considered at the individual level. So if you look at an individual level, would be things like cognition, reproduction, mortality, things that are measured, obviously, looking at an individual insect. See that over half of the hypotheses that have an outcome for an individual level insect are about pollution. And this is actually, we can quantify this using evenness, which is shown by these numeric values below the outcome label, where a 1 would be perfectly even. There's all 5 of, or however many drivers there are there, more than 5, are perfectly evenly going into that node. It'd be a value of 1. We see that some of these, like community and population and genetics, are all fairly evenly considered, although perhaps not that frequently considered for community and genetics. But this very much declines for colony and individual level outcomes. Okay, so that was kind of a quick run through of some of the specifics of this network that we built. But of course, what do we do? What are some useful things we can learn from collecting this information? And first is we considered taxonomic bias by proposed driver. Taxonomic bias in the literature, of course, is well known. But I think we can add perhaps a little more detail to specifically where this is coming from. And second, and really the motivation of, I think, this talk and the workshop I'm going to plug at the end of this talk, is identify topics that are perhaps ready for meta-analysis. So first, getting into the taxonomic bias, what I'm showing you here is a heat map where we have, on the x-axis, we have insect orders, or just all insects if the paper didn't specify, which is the rightmost column. And then on the Y, we have the different broad stressor categories. And a white box means there was no combination of paper that mentioned the hypothesis in that order. And then they get increasingly purple with the more studies. And we see from here that there's really a bias towards papers that are not specific, so all insects, but of the specific orders, it's Hymenoptera. And that's almost entirely being driven by just the two genera Apis and Bombus, which comprise 48% of all of the pathways that explicitly mention a particular taxon. So as we were extracting pathways, if it perhaps said climate change disrupts flora resources, which disrupts bee populations, we made sure to also note the taxonomy that was associated with that pathway, which is how we can associate or how we can do this. You also can see that pollution is the most reviewed driver, both in terms of hymenopterans, but also in terms of just insects broadly. And so when looking at this heat map, there are kind of two different ways I could think of that could create this pattern. It could be that there are some very highly studied topics within pollution that get biased towards Apis and Bombus. But then beyond that, all of the other like lesser studied topics are relatively evenly distributed. But say insecticides, highly studied, is biased towards there. Or it could be that essentially all of the hypotheses within pollution are biased towards a particular taxon. And so to do this, I created this weird, to look at this, I created this weird circle plot. There's no data on it yet, so don't worry, you're not missing anything. But thinking of, first, I don't know how to if anyone has seen something like this, let me know, because I just kind of came up with it and I don't know what to call it. So I'd appreciate any feedback on that also. But what we're showing you here is kind of these three slices of pie, these three pie slices that represent different orders of insects. And in a second, I'm going to start plotting nodes onto this plot that might look like this white node here. And essentially how we would read this is that this node might represent a stressor like flora resources. And we would say that when flora resources is considered, it's most often considered inside of Hymenoptera, which is why it's placed in that part of the circle. And we're also going to pay attention to how far it is removed from the origin. The further it is from the origin, that's going to tell us it's more biased towards Hymenoptera. And so in this case, it's on that outermost dotted line, which is going to tell us that 90% of the time when this hypothesis is proposed, it's proposed in reference to Hymenoptera. So I hope that makes sense, because here comes the data. And what we see here is that this taxonomic bias by hypothesis or by driver is not restricted to just a few well-studied nodes. It is actually more widely distributed, especially when it comes to outcome variables and when it comes to pollution variables, which are both heavily biased towards Hymenoptera, and which is really just Apis and Bombus. Although there are some other, we do see some bias towards other orders as well. I have a version of this figure at the very end of the talk that has all of these nodes labeled, if anyone's interested in what these are. But it looks really bad, so I figured I wouldn't put it in the main talk. Okay. So the other half of this is we can identify topics that are ready for meta-analysis. And so again, I'm showing you this heat map, the same heat map as before, a similar heat map, interpreted the same way, except this time we're only looking at path or hypothesized pathways that came from review papers. And now on the left, you see hypothesized pathways that come from meta-analysis papers. But we're keeping the same color scale across both figures. So you can see here that the interpretation here is that there are just far fewer papers that have actually kind of quantified or have done a quantitative synthesis of some of these proposed causal pathways than review papers. And if anything, there's actually even probably the pattern is even, most of them are more specific to a driver than they are specific to an insect order. So we can view this another way, and we can regenerate the same network I showed you. It feels like a year ago at this point, but probably like 10 slides ago, this kind of high resolution figure. But we can generate it only using pathways that come from reviews versus pathways that come from meta-analyses. And we do that so that from reviews, we generate 507 unique edges, but from meta-analysis, we only really get 119 unique edges. Again, there's an important caveat here that just because something is mentioned in a meta-analysis doesn't mean it was actually the focus or actually quantified in that paper. I can say from experience of reading these papers is I would say a decent number of these 119 actually are quantified. But there are, of this 119, there's even more that probably, or there's a decent subset that are not, even though they came from that paper. But so if I wanted to use this information to say, think about areas that we need meta-analysis from, it would be worth considering that there was a proposed hypothesis in a review paper that the authors probably have a decent read on the literature, and they said this impacts insects, but it's not in the meta-analysis network, so we should subtract those two to see what's left. And when you do, you get this network of edges that are mentioned in reviews, but not in meta-analyses. This really is the last kind of substantial slide of this talk. And so I wanted to highlight just some of this subset, some of them that are the most abundant. It doesn't mean that these are the most important. There's also, I haven't done an exhaustive search for all of these pathways, so there might be a paper out there that talks about this. But of the kind of remaining pathways, some of the most abundant or the most frequently mentioned of these were the impacts of pathogens on individuals, insecticides at a population level. There's insecticide effects on individuals is one of the most abundant subsets of quantified syntheses, but not on populations. Herbicides, extreme temperature, extreme precipitation, fungicides. I put extreme events, now realizing I then split it up above. So those are all kind of the same. Then overexploitation and beekeeping. So this really kind of, I'm hoping to be the launching point for, of course, at the end, we'll take questions, but also if people have suggestions, either something that they're interested in or what they think about this, I'd love to hear it. Before I get there, oh, yes, and of course, really meta-analyses on multiple stressors or most specific taxon driver combinations don't exist, right? So for instance, there's a paper on metal pollution, metal pollution impacting beetles. But if metal pollution is, which I would think it is, at least relevant to some other taxon, I haven't found a meta-analysis that considers that. So before I turn it over to everybody, first is we made this interactive. So if you follow the link here, I can put it in the chat too once we're done. A bit of a warning that currently it's hosted on the Shiny Apps website, which I suspect if more than 4 people try to use it at the same time, might break it. We are planning on eventually migrating this to a place that can perhaps hold more traffic. So if you go to it now, I promise it does work. It just might not work right now. But it generates this network, and you can actually subset. You can change the resolution of the terms. You can also subset by taxa, types of studies, and then different variables, and it'll regenerate the network. And also, you can click a tab at the top for studies, and it'll actually then produce the papers that are being used to generate that network.